It's been more than 20 years since genocide left Rwanda in ruins. Since then, the country has been painstakingly rebuilding itself. In his latest book, Trip Rwanda, A Journey into the New Heart of Africa, author Will Ferguson chronicles just how far the country has come. And Will Ferguson joins us now. I gotta tell you, first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here in person. Every time you've been on in the past, it's been on satellite.
Yes.
I kept thinking as I'm reading this book, wait a second, Will Ferguson is that funny guy. What is he doing writing a book about the least funny thing that happened in the world over the last 25 years?
Well, I'm up for the challenge, I think. But I think what it gets to is, it's not the genocide that interests me as the recovery, what happened after. To me, the genocide wasn't, we tend to think of Rwanda as frozen in time. When, in the 1994 genocide, when the Hutu majority decided to wipe out the Tutsi minority. And we tend to think that it stopped, time stopped, but of course it didn't. People are still trying to move their country forward. So that's what interested me, was the scope of the story.
I know you, obviously you focus on the rebuilding that has taken place in the intervening 20 years, but you do tell a lot of the story of the genocide in this book, yes, which is still, all these years later, absolutely harrowing. How and why did you want to revisit that?
I think I wanted to see, the human resilience interests me. The idea that no matter how, my family's from Northern Ireland, so maybe that's the root of it.
You're accustomed to suffering.
Yes, and the genocide cast such a pall, but I thought there has to be more to a culture than just the genocide. And I think of the Jewish culture, very layered with complexities and nuances and variety. The Jewish culture is not the Holocaust. The Holocaust had a huge impact. It affected the Jewish culture. It did not define the Jewish culture. And I felt that with the Rwandans, we were doing them a disservice, thinking that Rwanda is defined by the genocide.
Did you know much about it before you went there?
Not a lot. I knew about Diane Fossey, the Gorillas in the Mist. Her groundbreaking work was in Rwanda. There really are gorillas. There really are in the mist. But I also had a personal connection to it, is that I'm a descendant of David Livingstone.
That is amazing.
The Scottish explorer. Unfortunately, there is no rich Livingstone inheritance. So the source of the Nile is in Rwanda, the farthest source of the Nile. David Livingstone died trying to find it. I don't know why it was so hard for him to find. There's a sign with an arrow and everything, so it's very easy to find. But more importantly, I went there because I have a friend from Rwanda, Jean-Claude Munyazamo.
How'd you meet him?
I met him on a soccer pitch in Calgary. He was my son's soccer coach when they were 5. I should say he was coaching them, because at that age, all you want is for them to run in the same direction. That's it. And I got to know him. I got to know his kids. And he escaped from Rwanda just months before the killings began. He escaped across a bridge under sacks of coffee. So Jean-Claude and I went back, and I said, it's going to be a road trip, but we're going to revisit places that matter to you. Most of his family was wiped out, his extended family. We went back to the bridge that he escaped across. So this is a Jean-Claude on the actual bridge that's Rwanda behind him. He's looking at Tanzania, and I just snapped that. And this has become a kind of iconic photograph. And Jean-Claude laughs. He said, if I knew you were taking my photo, I would have been more prepared. But this is run in magazines and articles and on the web. And because what he's looking at is his future. And just before I took that photo, he said to me, you know, this is where the rest of my life began.
How did he end up in Calgary?
A really roundabout route. I tease Jean-Claude because most people, if you escape Rwanda, you go somewhere safer. He signed on as a volunteer with a program connected to CARE International. He went to Somalia. Then he went to South Sudan. So he was an overseas volunteer. He was sponsored into Canada by a church in Montreal. I think it was like a Catholic diocese. And he went to Montreal. You fall in love as you do. He moved to Calgary. He volunteered. He set up a program called Soccer Without Boundaries to help refugee children, low-income children. And on top of all that, he also volunteer coached my son's team. And that's how our lives crossed.
I get why you want to take him back to Rwanda and sort of see the place through his eyes, because that's an incredible story and you've told it brilliantly. Why does he want to take that journey?
You know, that's a good question. That's a very good question. And I wondered sometimes if what I was doing, if I was really, was I doing the right thing? But he was the one who initiated. He really wanted to go back. And I think it was very good. Jean-Claude said to me, he's glad he went back. Although, because the country's transformed. It's safe, it's stable, it's secure. They call it the Singapore of Africa. And he was amazed. He was driving, and it was disconcerting because he'd be looking, going, that building That building was not there. I said, keep your eyes, please, on the road. And that was not there before. So it was a transformation, and he was very buoyant. But I did notice as we drove that last day towards the bridge, he started to tense up. And I said, what's wrong? He said, I keep expecting a roadblock, because the militias would have roadblocks hunting, for Tutsis. And he said every hill, every corner, he was expecting a roadblock. So that bridge, I hope it was closure. I hope.
We should just take a moment, because you've mentioned Hutus and Tutsis, and one of the things I learned from your book was that these were not ethnic divisions in the way that Serbs and Croats and,
or Northern Ireland, religion.
That's fascinating. Just make that distinction for us, if you would.
Well, this is the thing. They're sometimes mislabeled as ethnic groups. They're actually social classes. So the Tutsis were traditionally cattle herders. The Hutu were traditionally farmers. The royal family was drawn from the Tutsis, but the Tutsis themselves were often just as poor as their Hutu neighbors. Under colonialism, under the Belgian rule, they decided that the Tutsis and Hutu were distinct races, and they gave you cards, Tutsi cards and Hutu cards. And those have become death warrants in about 50 years. And the Belgians systematically removed all the Hutu chiefs and replaced them. They favored the Tutsis. With independence came a movement called Hutu power. And that would spend 30 years festering and percolating, and it erupted in 1994. The RPF, Tutsi-led rebel force from Uganda, invaded.
This is Paul Kagame?
Paul Kagame, yeah, he was the leader of the RPF. And the president, the Hutu president, Habyarimana's plane was shot down, and hell was unleashed. And right in the middle of it was General Dallaire. He was
our general,
Canadian general was sent there. It wasn't a Canadian mission. He was the Canadian leader. There were Canadian advisors, but it was troops from Ghana, troops from Bangladesh, troops from Tunisia. He had 2,500 men. He wanted the UN to give him 5,000. They said, we're going to reduce it to 200 observers. He managed to keep about 450 because the Ghana refused to leave. And with 450 people, the mission was a failure. But he still managed to save that band between 10,000 and 30,000 people. Among them, Jean-Claude's sister and her little baby. So one of his family members was saved by a UN convoy.
There are a million heartbreaking stories that came out of the Rwandan genocide, they almost had 1 million people killed in this genocide. And one of the stories you tell in the book that will stay with me forever took place in a schoolhouse, where some rebels have taken over a schoolroom, and they want to separate the Hutu from the Tutsis. And you should pick up the story from here.
Well, it's Nyange School, and I have a photo in the book of the students standing in front of the classroom. And the genocide didn't end right on 1994. It wasn't like they turned a page, it was done. The Hutu power militias and government moved across the border into Zaire, which is now Congo. They continued attacking villages. It was anarchy in the West along the border. And one school, Nyange, it was a mixed school, a boarding school. This was Hutu and Tutsi students. Hutu power militias attacked in the middle of the night in 1997. 3 years after the genocide was supposed to end, they stormed the classroom, and they said, we know there's Tutsis here. They were armed with machine guns and grenades. They said, now, we want all the Hutu on one side, all the Tutsis on the other.
And the kids knew what that meant.
Oh, you knew exactly what that meant. They knew exactly. We are going to kill the Tutsi students. And a girl named Marie Chantal stood up, and she said, what I think is, I've always said, it's the most powerful word you can speak to tyranny. And she said, no. And they said, what do you mean, no? I said, Hutu on this side, Tutsis on this side, come on. She said, we're not going to do it. And a boy stood up named Sylvester. He said, no, there's no Hutu Tutsi here. There's just Rwandans here. And they dragged a girl from the group who happened to be Tutsi, killed her, shot Sylvester, who happened to be Hutu. They still would, having seen 2 of their classmates killed, they would not divide themselves. They would not separate. So they threw a grenade in, fired into the classroom. They killed 6 students, wounded some terribly. One girl lost her leg, her eye, and she could have walked free. She was one of the students who could have walked free if she'd betrayed her classmates. She now speaks on that. And for me, what that tells me is that the cycle of violence is broken. And the younger generation don't play these old games. Now, you get older people who are still very obsessed with Hutu Tutsi. But something has shifted. And for me, I stood in that classroom where 6 people died. 6 students, high school students died. And Steve, it sounds strange. I did not feel sad. I felt hopeful. There was a feeling, because they stood their ground. They did not divide themselves. They didn't die in vain. I think that's what it was. You thought they died. They died tragically, but they did not die like so many people died in the genocide in vain. They died. They drew a line and they wouldn't cross it.
So almost 20 years after that event, fair to say that most of Rwanda today does not divide itself into those 2 camps anymore?
They're not allowed to. It's a policy. The policy is one language, one people, one culture, one nation.
And is it working?
Yeah, it's working. You look at Burundi next door, which is a Hutu-Tutsi country, which went the other way, and they entrenched ethnic divides. And in Canada, without hitting any hot button topics, our politics don't tend to divide along ethnic lines, except the Bloc Québécois. That's probably our one that you could say is largely an ethnic party. But in Africa and in Rwanda and Burundi, the parties were absolutely ethnic. Rwanda is now officially, there is no Hutu, there is no Tutsi. Now, of course, in private, people know. One of the easiest ways is if you have family, you're probably Hutu. But they speak the same language, they have the same culture, even the surnames. I come from Northern Ireland. If I meet Seamus Murphy and Billy Johnston, I know which one is on which side. In Rwanda, you don't know that.
So I take it you left the country more optimistic.
It was fantastic. The gorillas, you got to go. You got to see.
Well,
Steve, just to see. You got to see this.
We do have a shot of this here. This is a photo you took during the so-called Gorillas in the Mist, and
no, I did not shoot that with a telephoto lens. He was as far away as you are to me. He was the dominant silverback. They're very calm. They're habituated. They're very careful with gorilla conservation to put the money back into the communities for health centers and schools. But here's the worst part: as a man, they tell you when you approach the silverback, first of all, don't look interested in the females. So and they said he will rear up. He will beat his chest. Do not be afraid. It's not aggressive. I was so pumped. We hiked 2 hours up this volcano. I was sweaty. I got there. The gorilla was eating celery, wild celery. He looked at me, and Steve, it was the most half-hearted chest beat. He stopped. He went thump, thump, whatever. And he
just wasn't impressed with you. Eh?
I was no threat. It was emasculating. I was no threat to him. So I was so disappointed. He just looked at me and went back, because we are no threat to them.
Diane Fossey, however, gave her life. She was killed trying to protect these animals. And, all of these years later, how precarious is their existence today?
It was down to less than 200. Today, because they're putting money back into the villages where the poachers came from, and they remind them, the government reminds them all the time, that new health center, that new school, the water pump, that's from gorillas. So poaching has ended on the Rwandan side. So the population is now approaching 800. So Diane Fossey almost single-handedly saved a species. Not many people can say that. She was murdered in '85. We don't know who, but most likely by a poacher.
Here's a quote from the book, Onward and Upward, we're calling this. Rwanda was a land left in genocidal ruin. Today, across the board, in terms of child mortality, healthcare, education, women's rights, poverty reduction, it is leading the way in Africa. The World Economic Forum places Rwanda among the best countries in the world when it comes to good governance, with accountability built into the system. But good governance is not the same as democratic. Okay, tell me what you mean by that.
Well, we obsess on everybody gets a voice in the West. We live in a bubble. And when we look at Rwanda, because Rwanda, when I say it's the Singapore of Africa, it is the Singapore of Africa. And we forget Singapore is an autocratic democracy.
You can go to jail and get beaten for chewing gum in public.
Yes, and in Rwanda, they won't maybe not put you in jail, but you cannot carry plastic bags, for example. They're illegal. So it's very much an autocratic government. It's an elected government, but it's very much autocratic, dominated by one party. Very safe, very stable, very secure. But in the West, we have this totemistic belief that democracy means everybody gets a say. What if you believe in Hutu power? Do you get a say? What if you just say, well, no, Hutu need to have a bigger voice. Tutsis are not trustworthy. Do I get a say? Rwanda is actually the most culturally homogenous country in Africa. They had social classes. They had one language, one culture. So I think in the West, we confuse good governments with, we like our democracy messy and chaotic. We like it. We like lots of voices, because nobody will launch a genocide in Canada. There's no ramifications. We can let the craziest fringe people talk. That's not the case in Rwanda.
No, they know from history.
Experience, sad experience.
I think our last parliament was about 23, 24% female. How are they doing there?
Rwanda, much better. In Rwanda, they didn't have enough women in parliament. They passed a law. 30% have to be female. In the last election, it was actually much higher. It was 64% of the Rwandan elected parliament are women.
64%.
It's the highest in the world, and it's the only parliament in the world where elected parliament in the world where women outnumber men. And everything in Rwanda, to me, this is my interpretation, is obsessed with not having another genocide. And I had so many Rwandans, because I said to men, doesn't it bug you? Like they're forcing, like we talk a good game in Canada, but would it bother you to say, no, it has to be 50% women? And they said, and you hate to gender stereotype, but there's a point. They said, if there were more women in the government, there never would have been a genocide.
Well, that's the key. We hear all the time, elect more women, our politics will change. So has that been the case there?
It has, absolutely. And you feel bad because we're not supposed to talk about gender differences, but can you imagine, because the government that created the genocide had almost no women. The one female cabinet minister was moderate. She was murdered.
So they killed her. Yeah.
Killed her right away.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a parliament with 64% women launching a genocide? I can't. So as much as in the West we like to pretend it doesn't matter, I think it does.
What underlies that answer is the notion that there are still plenty of people in Rwanda who fear history could repeat itself.
They're terrified. They're terrified.
So
of
that's still there.
Oh, it casts a dark shadow. But it's not a bad thing to be aware of the ramifications of the choices you make. So for me, it's in many ways a country with post-traumatic stress disorder. But it's also a country that's very, very aware of how bad things can go. Because in Rwanda, you can see the very worst that humanity can do. And you can see the very best. Like I say, it's a lesson in human resilience. And I don't think it's good just to forget. They say it's not, a Rwandan friend of mine, Melchior, he said to me, Will, we say in the West, you say, forgive and forget. I don't agree with that. Forgive and forget. I think it's remember and change.
Good advice. Paul Kagame, today, how is he regarded in the country?
President Paul Kagame, he's a lightning rod. He's not a warm and fuzzy guy. Paul Kagame, he's the one who led the RPF, overthrew the government, rebuilt the country. He always says that there's not one Rwanda miracle, there's millions. He's very autocratic. He's very blunt. He doesn't take criticism. He doesn't take any challenges. I should explain, there's still a group called the FDLR, which are former Hutu power militias who are still active on the border. So you imagine after World War II, the Nazi parties just moved across the border into Poland and are still there. So people love him or hate him, but the progress is undeniable. And this isn't propaganda from Rwanda. This is UNICEF, the World Bank, Transparency International, human rights organizations have criticized Rwanda because it's a very controlled society. And there are troubling signs in Rwanda about autocratic tendencies when we look at it from a Western lens. From the Western point of view, it seems very controlled.
That's the thing I want to follow up on, because theoretically there are term limits there, right?
Yes.
And he's supposed to be term limited out soon. But I guess the suspicion is that he's going to try and have a law passed saying he's allowed to stick around for another term. Do you think he understands that perhaps one of the best gifts he could give to his country would be ushering in the peaceful transition to a new leader? That's the $6 million question, is that the Rwandan constitution that they brought in said that you have 2 term limits of, I believe it's 7 years each. His terms are coming up in the next year. Rwandans are terrified that if he leaves, it's going to fall apart. But if you're a good leader, you build the institutions and it doesn't matter. And I spoke to Rwandans, I said, Canada is not a safe and stable country because of the quality of our leaders. Far from it. It's the strength of our institutions. We can weather inept people in Canada. We can weather corrupt people in Canada. We can weather these because our institutions are strong. I think Rwanda's built strong institutions. I don't think they need to change, but there was a big campaign to petitions to get Kagame to stay, and they are in the process, and I think it's going to happen. You think he will stay for a third?
I think they're going to rewrite the Constitution so he can stay. And I speak to my Rwandan friends and I say, I understand you're terrified because this man has brought you through this transformation. He stopped the genocide. He's got strong enemies abroad. There's people who really dislike him. I said, but what about the next president? if one president can rewrite the Constitution, what about a president in the future saying, you know, I think we're going to bring back identity cards? So I'm concerned. I mean, ultimately, it's Rwandans' choice. It's for Rwandans to decide. But it is a very worrisome situation because to go by opinion polls, the Rwandans overwhelmingly want him to stay. But here's the thing, a constitution is supposed to be a bedrock. Public opinion goes up and down, but we're supposed to have a bedrock constitution. And I think partly it's because the constitution of Rwanda is so young. They just wrote it, I think in 2000 and something. So I think maybe that's why they think of it as a work in progress. But the best thing you can do is to, like as you said, create a stable institution, a strong constitution.
The name of the book is Road Trip Rwanda, A Journey into the New Heart of Africa. Will, I just loved it. Congratulations. And it's so good of you to visit us here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Will Ferguson.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.